OSHA is getting serious about employee health around silica and respiratory health standards in the workplace. Why? Because more than 2.3 million workers are exposed to silica dust, which can cause lung cancer, silicosis, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and kidney disease. And get this, workers exposed may not experience symptoms for 15 to 20 years, but a simple chest x-ray can determine if there is lung damage. Well, in 2024, there's some major changes coming, and I brought in our expert, Rob Guillory, VP of CNS Occupational Medicine, to talk about what is coming and how employers can prepare. And let's first talk about the basics. What is silica dust and how does it get in the air and ultimately in the lungs of employees?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Luke. So silica is part of like sand particles, so very, very tiny. And basically anything, therefore, that has sand in it. It could be cement, it could be concrete, it could be stone that's being cut or manufactured, but even things like sheetrock that have sand particulate in them. So it gets in the air anytime that stuff is manufactured, anytime it's cut, anytime it's processed from its original content. That dust can then get into the air and affect people who are working with it.
Yeah, and in hopes to protect employees from getting sick, OSHA's been rolling out new silica standards 2016, 2017, slowly implementing it over the years. Basically, it was doubling the respiratory testing measurement rules, but it just wasn't enough. There's a lot more changes coming. What rules are likely to change in 2024 and beyond?
Yeah, so in particular, the mining industry is looking at kind of matching up with OSHA. MSHA, which is the Mining Safety Health Administration, is trying to align with their partners and be a little bit more strict as far as what's called the permissible exposure limit. So how much you can be exposed to over a time-weighted average of a single day. So they're getting closer to their peers, and they're trying to hone in on the fact that they recognize that a lot of people have been sick, and they can prevent a lot of those exposures.
Yeah, and so the mining industry, I know there's a research done from the University of Illinois Chicago that's found a clear link between silica exposure and severe black lung disease for contemporary coal miners today. So it makes sense that they're wanting to do this. Catching up to these standards that were rolled out previously in other industries. But there's also another piece that's potentially coming in 2024, and that's the medical removal protection. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So not only are they addressing how much they can be exposed to, they're also addressing the fact that those individuals have to have more medical surveillance. So simply just handing a respirator to folks and saying, oh, it'll be okay, that's not going to fix the problem. Yeah. So yes, they have to wear respirators. Yes, they have to have medical surveillance in place before they can wear those respirators. But then afterwards, if they've recognized on an annual basis that whether via chest x-ray or their respiratory health questionnaire or actual medical examination that this person has had an exposure or is at increased risk for illness, they can actually take that person out of commission and not allow them to work in a job where they would be exposed to silica or where they have to wear a respirator at all due to decreased lung capacity.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. And, it's that specific piece. So the mining industry one, that's expected to come out, I think it's held in the White House budget office to be released, and that could be released by April of this year. And then the medical surveillance for medical removal is expected, again, sometime this year, and I think it's around April as well.
Probably likely to follow shortly after, yes, sir.
Yeah, and so, we mentioned earlier, we talked a little bit about this respiratory measurement rules getting stricter, and really, safety managers are frequently expressing confusion with OSHA's new silica standards just because there's so much changing and a lot of changing in a lot of different industries. What employee testing standards are required now, and what do these tests look like?
So for the initial permissible exposure limits, that's usually working with like an industrial hygienist or someone like that who's actually going to come out and take measurements over these time-weighted averages to get an idea of how much exposure is in place. But then for the measures that are going to be in place for employers, for their employees, we're talking about education pieces to make sure they understand what silica is and where and how they're exposed, annual OSHA respirator questionnaires, making sure that they're capable and healthy enough to wear a respirator, and then actually having a medical surveillance exam. So depending on how they answer that health history questionnaire, depending on their current or previous exposures, having additional tests like pulmonary function testing, where we actually measure their lung capacity. They may have to have an EKG depending on their heart history, which can be affected by your lungs. And then all the way up into that chest x-ray that you talked about, that has to be read by a special person who's trained by the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health to do what's called a B read on that x-ray and specifically look for silica damage, compared to just a general chest x-ray where you might be looking for pneumonia or any other inflammatory process.
And I think one of the pieces in there as well is testing for tuberculosis. And I know TB has been determined as sort of a great mimicker of respiratory issues. And so that test is important. What does that test look like, and what happens if something comes back positive?
Yeah, excellent question. So to your point, tuberculosis is kind of a lung disease that is a bacterial infection that can cause your lungs to not function appropriately. And those folks who either have had it in the past or currently have it, they're at greater risk for developing other lung issues. So there are traditional skin tests where we can expose them to a toxin that essentially allows us to see whether or not they've previously been exposed to TB. But kind of the gold standard for that testing is to take a blood sample and send that to the lab, and we can tell if they've ever been exposed. And if either of those comes back as a positive, then that individual would also get a chest x-ray to kind of determine if they have any lung tissue injury that is aligned with tuberculosis.
And so I know one of the things that employers get confused about as well is what happens if an employee refuses one or all parts of these tests? Are they just supposed to offer these tests and they get to decide, or what does that look like?
Yeah, so for an employee, it has to be during working hours that these things are done, and they also have to be free of charge to the employee. So, employers have to do a really good job from not only a safety standpoint, but an HR standpoint, to make sure that people understand why these are being done. Not only is it the safest and best thing for the employee, but the employers are required to have them do this. So if somebody's unwilling to do it, they might be subject to having to change their current job duties or be removed or potentially terminated for not allowing the company to comply with what they're doing.
And a lot of these different testing and respiratory fit tests, we're talking about this with Silica specifically, which is a lot of different industries, but what other industries can benefit from respiratory fit testing?
Oh, absolutely. So it can really range in a wide variety of tests. So we're talking about a cotton dust standard for people who manufacture our clothes and our jeans that are exposed to that. They have respiratory protection in place. Asbestos, people who remove or work with asbestos, insulation, homes like that. Anybody who does hazardous materials. So we're talking about anywhere from firefighters to people who go in and do mold abatement. All of those individuals would be wearing a respirator to protect them from airborne contaminants, and so they would all be subject to those respiratory questionnaires. And
we recently gone through COVID, and we understand sort of the basics of the masks. Those are sort of the best of the simplest type of respirator masks out there. Like there's the medical industry that could do respiratory fit testing as well if they want to be protected in different ways. Recently, the last couple years, there's been like the avian flu outbreak, and so a lot of people in the poultry industry were like, should we have respiratory fit testing? It's pretty interesting, but definitely important. How many of these, what this test can be used in so many different fields, and so important to employee health. And you mentioned too, we talked a little bit about that TB testing, and you mentioned if you have tuberculosis or there's a correlation between tuberculosis and silica exposed employees, and it's basically up to 30 times more likely to develop pulmonary TB infection if having silica exposure, which is intense. And so, again, all this is around employee health, and employers should definitely be thinking about all these different pieces that they need to think about. The other piece that they have to think about is, the record keeping and what is required at the workplace all the way to the testing and the record keeping. What are some of the rules that they have to deal with?
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of things come into play, obviously in the medical field, and there's a lot of confusion as far as HIPAA standards. What can we give or can we not give? So it's important for employers to know that medical clearances of yes, you've been cleared or no, you have not been cleared. Those things should come to the employer, and they have those in their record keeping. So we're keeping records that we've trained employees, that they have completed their questionnaires, that they've had their required medical things, depending on their potential exposures or previous exposures, and that they have been cleared to wear a respirator and operate in that manner. But they don't have to keep necessarily the individual medical health history questionnaires that person may have filled out at the doctor.
Right.
So while they're able to keep track of the fact that the person is cleared to wear a respirator, they're not necessarily privy to the information that person has high blood pressure or cholesterol issues, things like that.
No, that makes sense. And then as far as the work site itself, I mean, there's the air standards, making sure the air monitoring that they have to keep data on, which became more strict. And so there's a lot of things that the employer has to think about on that end as well. Now, a lot of these tests, it has to do with like X-rays and other, different physicians. Can these be done on site at like a medical facility, OCMed place, or off-site, like on their own workplace?
Yeah, that's a great question. So ultimately, it depends who you partner with for your medical surveillance programs. Many of them are done in a clinic. That's typically where most groups have sent their individuals because they have things like X-ray in place. There are places like ourselves where we partner with other groups that maybe do mobile X-ray to complement the mobile health that we do. So we could actually go on site, do all of the physicals, do all of the blood work, do all the testing, and then also have that mobile X-ray group there to kind of get everything done all in one spot. So if you're lucky enough to partner with somebody who does all of them in one place, then yes, you could absolutely have it done on site, presuming that they're licensed to do so. For most employers, they're sending folks out and kind of having to chase down and gather those records. So finding a good medical surveillance group to help work through that for your employees is a huge benefit.
Yeah, and the other testing that we can do on site, you got audiograms, you've got, maybe a drug test or other things, and it can be, it can be all an on-site sort of work employee health event that we can come on site for and tackle a lot of these different pieces that they would need to do, whether it's annually or at least the first time if it's like a new hire, for example. But
absolutely, yeah. A lot of employers used to think like the annual biometrics of like blood draw and let me test your blood pressure and your cholesterol. They would offer that to their employees. But now more and more groups are starting to recognize that groups like ours can come on site and perform more of those things that they have to do annually, like you mentioned, whether it's audiograms or these OSHA respirator questionnaires and fit testing, things like that. It could potentially all be done on site.
Awesome. Well, I think we covered a lot of this. Are there other things that are coming down the road with OSHA? I know summer is approaching. Heat injury is one thing that they're thinking. They're always stressing in different regions. But what else is coming that employers should be thinking about this year?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think to your point, heat is always, it was a big issue last year. Yeah. And so that means they're going to be focusing on it again, even heavier this year. And I think the biggest piece for that is making sure that people have written plans, action plans, especially for groups like construction where they're maybe out at a site and they're not sitting at an office or working at a manufacturing. The other big piece that they're focusing on is new employees. So for a lot of these standards, whether it's silica or respiratory in general, or even heat, a lot of those injuries and issues for accidents, they actually occur in the first 2 to 3 weeks of employment, and probably 50% of them happen in the first 6 months of employment. So the more that they can focus on those education and training pieces early on to make sure that individual is trained, the better they're going to be not only for that employee and for their company, but for OSHA regulations as well.
Exactly, and as far as the training goes, we have training. We work with employers and things like that to do all different types of training, that whether it's for their own health and purposes, or we write tons of articles. We have these videos coming out, so feel free to subscribe to our channel, follow us on social media, and be sure to stay up to date. There's a lot of things that change, a lot of things that happen, and we understand HR professionals, at a workplace. Your role, safety managers, your roles can touch so many different pieces that maybe this is a small piece for you, but it's extremely important. And some of the pieces that we can handle and take off your chest, that's what we can do here at CNS Occupational Medicine. From helping with the drug testing or even drug testing policies. If that's something you're looking at updating, we can help you walk through what should be required, depending on where you are, what states, if you have multiple locations, what to think about. It gets complicated. So work with experts. If you want something on-site or off-site, at least reach out to us to see what options we have available, and we can, get you in place to get your employees, making sure your employees are healthy and safe, making sure that the employer is protected and following all the rules and regulations that are required of you. Rob, thank you for coming on. If there are any questions, you want more information, contact us. You can give us a call at 800-551-9816 or email us at info@cnsocmed.com. And as always, feel free to write some comments down in the comments below. With that, and as always, stay safe out there.